As I think it is, I have no reason to doubt that it's not a right one. If it is, then I think it's got to be £150,000.
Oh well.
I think it's the most important firearm I've ever seen on the roadshow.
An old gun hanging on a wall in your house for decades could turn out to be worth more than a luxury car. Can you believe that? Welcome to Antique Discoveries. In this video, we're uncovering the most valuable guns and military relics ever appraised on Antiques Roadshow. From forgotten battlefield weapons and rare military artifacts to family heirlooms passed down for generations, these items seemed like ordinary pieces of history. Some sat untouched in attics, some gathered dust in basements, and some were nearly thrown away. But once the experts uncovered their true stories, the valuations left owners completely stunned. These weren't just old war relics, they were hidden fortunes hiding in plain sight.
This is something that would need to be insured for about $5,000.
Wow. Really? Boy, that's amazing.
If someone asked you to name the single firearm that changed the future of modern warfare, you'd probably think of a machine gun, an assault rifle, or some revolutionary weapon from the 20th century. You probably wouldn't think of a small revolver made nearly 200 years ago. But that's exactly where today's story begins.
I've had it over 40 years, and I've always collected antique arms.
And this pistol was made by Sam COLT in Paterson, New Jersey, and his patent was 1836.
Yeah.
I would say that this was actually made in the first months of 1837.
That was the breakthrough moment. Because if the expert was correct, this wasn't simply an early Colt revolver. It could be one of the very first examples produced after Colt's revolutionary design entered the world. And that changes everything. Today, firing 5 rounds without reloading sounds completely ordinary. In 1837, it was a different story. Most soldiers were still carrying firearms that fired once and then required a lengthy reload before they could shoot again. In a real fight, those extra seconds could mean the difference between survival and disaster.
And you would have 5 shots because it's a revolver.
Yeah.
Now, Colt didn't invent the revolver, he just perfected it.
And that perfection is what made this firearm so important. It proved that sustained firepower was possible. It showed what the future could look like. For many historians, firearms development can almost be divided into 2 periods, before revolvers like this and after them. The experts certainly believed its importance went that far.
In my opinion, this is the most important firearm ever made in the development and the history of firearms.
By now, there was only one question left. How much was something like this actually worth? And perhaps even more surprising, how much had the owner paid for it all those years ago?
So, how much did you buy it for?
Originally, I paid £150 for it.
Well, I have no reason to doubt that it's not a right one. If it is, then I think it's got to be £150,000.
From £150 to £150,000. A 1,000-fold increase. The kind of valuation that would shock almost any collector. But even that wasn't the biggest surprise. After decades spent examining historic firearms, the expert believed he was looking at the single most important firearm he had ever encountered on Antiques Roadshow. And somehow, this was only the beginning of our countdown. If the Colt revolver we just saw helped change the way wars were fought, the next item tells a very different story. A story about an obsession with precision. About one man who devoted his skill, time, and craftsmanship to chasing perfection down to the smallest detail. And somehow, the result sat quietly in a family collection for generations.
I got this gun from my grandfather. What I know of the gun is it was made in approximately 1850 by a man whose name was James Anthony.
This firearm was never intended for a battlefield. It wasn't designed to win a war. It was built for something entirely different. Absolute accuracy. The kind of accuracy that shooters spent years trying to achieve.
It's called a bench gun.
Okay.
And the reason was it was meant to be shot from a bench.
Okay.
Bench target shooting was a very precision form of shooting.
By the mid-19th century, precision target shooting had become a popular pastime. Many enthusiasts built their own firearms as a hobby, but very few reached the level of craftsmanship that James Anthony achieved here. The moment the expert examined the rifle, he knew there was something unusual about it. And it wasn't just the design, it was the condition, because what he was looking at simply shouldn't have survived like this.
The most remarkable thing I find about this is the condition of the guns. I mean, they're pristine, they're new. I mean,
more than 150 years had passed, yet the rifle looked as if it had left the workshop only yesterday. And the closer the expert looked, the more surprises he found.
he has silver-plated furniture, all the original finish, the engraved and silver-plated butt plate. He gold-banded in some places the breeches, and they also have platinum blowout plugs.
Silver, platinum, multiple interchangeable barrels, and nearly every original accessory still intact. At that point, this no longer felt like a simple firearm. It felt more like a mechanical work of art, a masterpiece created by someone who refused to settle for anything less than perfection.
I think at auction they could easily fetch between $10,000 and $15,000.
Okay. Wow.
From a forgotten family heirloom, the rifle had become a piece valued at $10,000 to $15,000. An impressive number. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the story wasn't the valuation. It was the fact that a largely unknown craftsman working in the mid-1800s had created something so extraordinary that it could still leave experts speechless more than a century and a half later. And the next story will take us far away from peaceful target ranges and into a battlefield where a single bullet may have changed one man's fate forever. If you came across a sword that had been stuck inside its scabbard for more than 150 years, your first assumption would probably be that it had simply been damaged beyond repair. But this sword wasn't ruined by age. It was locked in place by a single moment that unfolded on a Civil War battlefield. A moment that may have saved the life of the man carrying it.
I brought my great-great-grandfather's Civil War sword.
Alongside the sword was a letter sent home near the end of 1863. That letter transformed this object from a military relic into a first-hand witness to history. But that wasn't the most surprising part.
It hit that scabbard so hard, it drove the scabbard into the sword, and no matter how hard you try, you cannot pull that sword out of there.
According to the soldier, a bullet struck the sword while it was still inside the scabbard. The impact was so powerful that it distorted the entire structure. And from that day forward, the sword was never drawn again.
He writes home from Raccoon Mountain, Georgia on December 3rd, 1863. And he writes home that a ball, meaning a bullet, hit my sword while in the scabbard. I cannot get the sword out. I will send it home to you.
Then the expert noticed something even stranger. The soldier had inserted the sword into the scabbard backwards, a mistake that would be almost impossible under normal circumstances. That could only mean one thing. Everything around him must have been complete chaos. What could have been happening that was so frantic, so desperate, that a trained soldier shoved his sword into its scabbard the wrong way?
Something was going on crazy around him because he put the sword in backwards. Then it was hit. It probably saved at least his leg.
And then the bullet came. The massive dent is still there today. A scar that tells a life-or-death story more clearly than many history books ever could. Without that sword, the bullet might have gone straight into the soldier's body. But did that incredible story actually make the sword more valuable?
As a group, this is something that would need to be insured for about $5,000.
Wow.
About $5,000. Not the highest valuation on today's list, but very few artifacts can document the exact moment a human life may have been saved by nothing more than a piece of metal. And the next story will take us to an object created during wartime by a man who was living through that war himself.
This came from my grandfather, through my father to me. And my grandfather made it during the First World War, actually in France.
But he made it there.
He made it there with the help of another member of the battalion.
And what they chose to recreate was one of the most intimidating weapons of the era, a railway gun. These enormous artillery pieces were capable of firing over incredible distances, and during the war they became symbols of industrial-scale destruction.
Railway guns were used by the British and the Germans and the French as large. They had an enormous range, and indeed the Germans from the German lines on the Western Front were able to shell Paris.
Yet what fascinated the expert wasn't the real weapon. It was the miniature version sitting on the table. The closer he looked, the more remarkable it became. This wasn't a simple model. It was a functioning machine built with astonishing attention to detail.
What I love about this is it's so detailed that it all works.
Then came the moment nobody expected. For the first time in decades, the mechanisms began to move. What made the scene even more surprising was that the current owner had never actually seen many of these parts operate before.
Now, if you turn this little lever here...
I've never seen that done
Never
before.
done this?
No.
Good heavens.
The breech opened. The mechanism shifted into place. The model began doing exactly what it had been designed to do more than a century earlier. And suddenly, everyone in the room was looking at it differently. What had seemed like a decorative family heirloom now felt like a direct connection to a soldier who had spent countless hours recreating a machine of war by hand.
I think for the whole complex, you would look at about £2,000 or £3,000.
Really?
But no!
A valuation of £2,000 to £3,000 is certainly respectable. But the real significance of this piece goes far beyond money, because this isn't just a model railway gun. It's a memory preserved in metal created during a war that helped reshape the modern world. And the next story takes us into an even more secretive world, where even the true name of the organization was hidden from the people around it. If someone handed you an identification pass bearing the name of an organization you'd never heard of, you would probably assume it belonged to some ordinary government department. But during World War II, the most ordinary names were sometimes invented to conceal the most extraordinary secrets. And that's exactly where this story begins. Not with a weapon, not with a medal, but with a simple pass.
This is a pass for Lieutenant L.H. Massey of the Inter-Services Research Bureau. It's interesting because the Inter-Services Research Bureau didn't exist.
It didn't exist. At least, not in the way people believed it did. According to the family, the owner's father was summoned to London, handed this pass, and told that he had just joined the organization. But that was only the beginning of the story.
He was given that pass and told he joined the organisation. He was then taken into another room who told him that, in fact, Inter-Services Research Bureau, which he'd never heard of, was the cover name for SOE, Special Operations Executive.
The SOE, the Special Operations Executive. A secret wartime organization created to carry out missions that most people would never even know had taken place. And alongside the officer who carried that pass was another remarkable artifact. A Fairbairn Sykes fighting dagger, the iconic weapon of Britain's wartime commandos.
I'm assuming he bought this, Fairbairn Sykes fighting dagger.
My father knew Lieutenant Sykes and worked with him in SOE.
That was the moment the expert became especially interested. Fairbairn Sykes daggers still appear on the collector's market from time to time. But very few come with a story like this. And then the details became even more extraordinary.
This is a first pattern, third type. They didn't make very many of them. It was handled by Sykes, out of Fairbairn and Sykes.
Rarity alone would have made this dagger desirable. But provenance changed everything. According to the expert, this wasn't just an early and exceptionally scarce example. It had actually been handled by Lieutenant Sykes himself, one of the men who designed the weapon. That is the kind of provenance military collectors almost never encounter.
With that, I would put £5,000 on that.
I'm astonished.
It's
around £5,000. An impressive valuation. Yet it was clear that the owner was moved by something far more meaningful than the money. For years, this family had unknowingly preserved a tangible connection to one of the most secretive organizations of World War II. And as remarkable as these military stories have been, Antiques Roadshow still has even more extraordinary discoveries waiting to be revealed. If someone offered to trade an antique bottle for an old walking cane, most people would probably see it as nothing more than an ordinary exchange. That's exactly what the man in this story thought. He took the cane home knowing almost nothing about it, and it wasn't until he brought it to Antiques Roadshow that he realized he might have made one of the best trades of his life.
Well, actually, I got it in trade from with a very good friend of mine. I traded a nice old bottle that he was interested in.
What do you know about it?
I know very little, or actually I should say nothing about it.
He didn't know where it came from. He didn't know how old it was. He certainly didn't know what it was worth. The only thing he did know was that this walking cane could also function as a firearm. But that turned out to be only the first secret it was hiding.
Well, it's one of the most wonderful items I've seen in a long time. It's a gun cane. It's a pistol cane.
Within seconds, the expert could hardly hide his excitement, because the man who made this remarkable piece wasn't just another gunsmith. It was Jacob KUNZ, one of Philadelphia's most celebrated gunmakers during the early 19th century. And the moment that name was mentioned, the entire story took a very different direction.
It was made by one of the premier gunsmiths in Philadelphia, whose name was Jacob KUNZ.
According to the expert, Jacob KUNZ became famous for firearms that have all but disappeared from today's market. His name is even connected to one of the most famous expeditions in American history. That kind of provenance is enough to capture the attention of any serious collector. But had this trade really turned into the bargain it seemed to be?
What was the bottle worth that you traded?
Well, my friend valued the bottle at about $1,000 to $1,500.
Between $1,000 and $1,500. At first glance, it sounded like a perfectly fair trade. At least until the expert revealed what the cane was actually worth.
I'll tell you, I think you did all right, because I think this really is worth $10,000 to $15,000.
$10,000 to $15,000.
$10,000 to $15,000.
I'm sure my friend will be contacting me.
In just a few seconds, the value of the item had jumped to nearly 10 times what he had traded away. It was about discovering that an ordinary-looking walking cane was actually the work of one of America's greatest master gunsmiths. Some military antiques become valuable because they are incredibly rare. Others are prized because they have survived in remarkable condition. But sometimes a single name attached to an object is enough to change everything. And that is exactly what makes this pair of pistols so fascinating. They had remained in the same family for generations, along with a story that no one could truly verify, at least not until the experts began examining them.
This pair of flintlock pistols has been in my family for generations. They originally belonged to William Colfax, who...
William Colfax. It isn't a name that most people recognize today. But if the family story was true, these pistols may once have belonged to a man who stood remarkably close to the center of American history.
And he was captain of George Washington's Commander-in-Chief's Guard. So these pistols were given to William Colfax by General Washington.
If that account was accurate, everything changed. These were no longer simply a pair of 18th century flintlock pistols. They could be artifacts connected to the elite guard that protected George Washington during the American Revolution. That is exactly the kind of provenance collectors dream of discovering.
This is a pair of pistols that are Queen Anne flintlock style, Continental, from 1770 to 1780.
Even if the entire Washington connection were set aside, the pistols would still be extraordinary. They were made during the very years that shaped the birth of the United States. Their age alone makes them exceptionally important historical artifacts. But could the family story really change their value?
Even without that association, are worth about $5,000 in and of by themselves.
It's amazing.
The pistols themselves were already worth at least $5,000. That means any connection to William Colfax or George Washington would be valued beyond that figure. And perhaps that explains why this family protected them for so many generations.
You are a very lucky person to have such a great family history.
Sometimes the greatest value of a historical artifact isn't found in its steel or its craftsmanship. It's found in the story that survives with it. A story passed from one generation to the next, transforming a pair of antique pistols into a lasting reminder of the birth of a nation. Many American families still keep the items their fathers or grandfathers brought home after World War II. Most of them are simply remembered as wartime souvenirs. But every now and then, one of those souvenirs turns out to be far older than the war that brought it back. And that's exactly the story behind this pistol.
I got it from my dad. He brought it back from Germany or Austria when he was in World War II.
Like countless other veterans, the owner's father returned home with this firearm after the war. What makes the story even more interesting is that the family still has the official document signed by his commanding officer, authorizing him to bring it back to the United States. Because of that, the pistol's journey is unusually well documented. Its true origin, however, was something no one expected.
You actually have a piece of paper signed by his commanding officer saying that it was okay. Well, it's a German pistol, and it was made in the mid-18th century.
The mid-18th century. That means this pistol was already more than 250 years old. It didn't belong to World War II. It simply passed through that conflict before eventually becoming a family keepsake in America. And that was only the first surprise.
And one of the ideas was to have, if you cock the hammer back, there's a little release here, and the barrels turn over.
At the time, gunsmiths were searching for a solution to one of the biggest problems every soldier faced. How could they fire more than one shot before reloading? This pistol offered an ingenious answer. Its rotating barrel mechanism gave the shooter an immediate second shot with just a few simple movements.
And one of the ideas was to have, so now you would be able to have 4 shots instead of 2.
It was an idea well ahead of its time. But history came with a trade-off. During the 19th century, the pistol was converted from its original flintlock system to percussion. The modification once made it more practical to use. Today, however, it reduces its appeal to serious collectors.
At auction, I would figure it would sell for about $2,000 to $4,000.
Really?
Yeah. If it was original flintlock, it would be at least double that.
Oh, wow.
Even so, an auction value of $2,000 to $4,000 was enough to surprise the owner. But the most memorable part of this story wasn't the valuation. It was the extraordinary journey of a pistol that survived for more than 2 centuries, passed through multiple eras and a world war, and ultimately arrived on Antiques Roadshow as a remarkable witness to history. Some forgotten objects spend decades in an attic. Others sit untouched in a garage or a basement. But the next item was left inside a toolbox because everyone in the family believed it was nothing more than an old mechanical tool. That simple misunderstanding almost led to a mistake no one saw coming.
This used to be my great-grandfather's, and my grandfather inherited it. He didn't know what it was, so he thought it was a tool.
For years, it sat among wrenches, screwdrivers, and other ordinary tools. No one ever imagined it was a firearm. That only changed after the family began sorting through their grandfather's belongings following his passing.
We were going through his things, and my other grandfather pulled it out, and he wasn't sure what it was and started to suppress it, and my father said, "Don't do that."
A single warning came just in time, because the tiny object in his hand was, in fact, a gun. Not an ordinary pistol. It was a palm pistol, one of the most unusual firearm designs of the late 19th century.
It's a pretty cool little gun, and it's really a novelty, made by the Chicago Arms Company.
At first glance, it's hard to believe this was ever designed for personal protection. It doesn't resemble a conventional handgun. There is no traditional grip, no familiar trigger. Everything about it was engineered to fit neatly into the palm of the user's hand, and its firing mechanism was even more unconventional.
So it operated with a rotary system inside, and we have 7 chambers.
Instead of pulling a trigger with one finger, the shooter simply squeezed the entire grip. It was a remarkably bold idea for the late 1800s. That unusual design is exactly what makes palm pistols so desirable to collectors today, especially since relatively few examples have survived the passage of time.
Condition is everything with guns. This has got most of the original finish. A gun like this would retail at a gun show easily $2,000.
Wow.
Around $2,000. For an object the family had long mistaken for an ordinary tool. That's exactly why stories like this continue to fascinate Antiques Roadshow viewers. Because sometimes the most valuable treasure in the house is the one nobody ever thought was worth a second look. Some collections become valuable because of their size. Others are admired because of their rarity. But the next collection carries something even more remarkable: centuries of history, art, and culture engraved directly into every weapon. And the moment the expert saw these pieces, he almost immediately realized he was looking at something extraordinary.
Can you tell me how they came into your possession?
They belong to my dad from his collection. There is around about 500 pieces in his collection.
500 artifacts. A lifetime devoted to collecting. The pieces on the table today represent only a small part of that remarkable collection. According to the expert, the owner's father began collecting at exactly the right time, long before the market truly recognized the value of Asian military antiques.
This one in particular is one of my favorites. It's a South Indian bichua.
Okay.
Bichua translates as scorpion sting.
The first piece immediately caught the expert's attention. Not simply because it was a rare weapon, but because the bronze hilt tells stories drawn from Hindu mythology. At that moment, it became clear that this was far more than a weapon. It was also a work of art.
And up here we have a katar, or a katar, and it's a classical Indian weapon, a punch dagger. This example is 17th century, possibly late 16th century.
Wow.
Then came another extraordinary piece. A katar dating from the late 16th or early 17th century. It had already existed long before many modern nations were even founded. But the biggest surprise was still waiting.
It's not a piece to be used in anger.
Okay.
It's a status object or a gift. Must have been made as a special commission for a ruler, a Maharaja.
This was never intended to be an ordinary battlefield weapon. It was commissioned specifically for a Maharaja, a symbol of authority and prestige rather than a tool of combat. That royal provenance immediately placed it in an entirely different category.
He got his investment back right with this piece here, £8,000 to £10,000.
Wow.
The punch dagger, the katar at the top here, a similar one was sold in a German auction a few years ago, approximately £30,000, £35,000. The one at the front, it's unique. A conservative figure would be 30 to 40,000.
Oh my. Right.
Total value, we're looking at 70 to 80,000 pounds.
It's a powerful reminder that the greatest value isn't always found in one extraordinary object. Sometimes it's found in the vision of a collector who recognized true significance long before the rest of the world did. Some cases on Antiques Roadshow begin with the object itself. This one begins with the box. Because there are certain boxes that tell an expert something extraordinary is waiting inside long before the lid is ever opened. The moment he saw this one, he was barely interested in what the box might be worth. He simply wanted to discover what it was protecting.
If I was given the choice of taking the money or opening the box, faced with a lovely box like this, I would always open this because I think this is going to contain something very special.
Crafted from ebony with brass inlay and reinforced metal corners, every detail suggested that this case had been built to safeguard something truly exceptional. And when the lid was finally lifted, the expert immediately knew his instinct had been right.
My choice would have been absolutely correct. There is a wonderful pair of pistols in here.
At first glance, many people would assume they were a pair of dueling pistols. In reality, they served a completely different purpose. These were elegant saloon pistols, designed for indoor target shooting, a fashionable pastime enjoyed by Europe's upper class during the late 19th century. The closer the expert looked, the more impressive they became.
And they're called saloon pistols, but they're for indoor target shooting.
Really?
You can see the striker runs the whole way across there. Now that is so that it hits the little 7mm cartridge in 2 places.
Even the firing mechanism reflected remarkable craftsmanship. Every feature had been engineered to improve the reliability of the relatively new rimfire cartridge. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful innovation that distinguished a master gunmaker from an ordinary one.
They are Belgian. They were made in Liège.
All right.
And they are about 1875, that sort of era. These pistols are of really the highest quality.
Made in Liège, one of Europe's most celebrated gun-making centers, these pistols represent the highest level of craftsmanship of their era. They were never intended for the battlefield. They were created to display refinement, precision, and prestige.
And I think if these appeared at auction, they would do £5,000 very easily, and on a really good day, they might do 10.
Wow, that's fantastic.
An auction value of £5,000 to £10,000 was a fitting reward for such extraordinary workmanship. Yet perhaps the most memorable part of this story wasn't the valuation at all. It was the fact that an experienced expert recognized something exceptional before the box was even opened, proving that sometimes the first treasure isn't what's inside the case, but the case itself. One of the most satisfying moments on Antiques Roadshow is when someone walks in with an object and has absolutely no idea what they're really holding. That is exactly how this story begins. The owner believed he had brought in nothing more than a Civil War cartridge box. An interesting military relic, but certainly not an exceptionally rare one. At least that was what he had always believed.
It's what I believe is a Civil War cartridge pouch.
Would you be surprised if I told you it's a little earlier than Civil War?
Yeah, I would be.
With just one question, the entire story changed. Not the Civil War. Something almost a century older. And moments later, the truth was revealed.
That's because this is an original Revolutionary War soldier's cartridge box.
No kidding.
And it's not 43rd New York, and it's not 43rd Massachusetts.
Suddenly, the object on the table was no longer an ordinary military artifact. It had become a surviving relic from the American Revolutionary War. According to the expert, this cartridge box may even have been present at famous battles such as Lexington and Bunker Hill. If that's true, it witnessed some of the earliest chapters in the history of the United States.
It had, to this point, the only known non-excavated example of that plate. It's got the original buff leather shoulder sling. It's got the original closure tab, still present. It's got the original wooden block on the inside of it.
But its historical importance was only part of the story. What truly excited the expert was its remarkable condition. Nearly every major component had survived intact after almost 250 years. That is extraordinarily rare for any military artifact from this period.
Finding all of those things together is like lining up all of those numbers on a lottery ticket.
To a collector, discovering an artifact like this is almost the equivalent of winning the lottery. And by now, everyone knew its value would be nothing like that of an ordinary Civil War cartridge box.
If this was a Civil War cartridge box, with the sling and everything, you're talking around $1,000, maybe $1,500 if it's really pretty. This one, on today's market, would retail for between $20,000 and $25,000. I think without a doubt, it would bring at least 50, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if it didn't bring twice that.
What the owner believed was a $1,000 military relic suddenly became an artifact worth at least $50,000 with the potential to bring twice that amount. That's the kind of twist that makes Antiques Roadshow so compelling. Because sometimes the greatest value of a historical object isn't determined by how it looks, but by the exact moment in history it managed to survive. Among the thousands of stories featured on Antiques Roadshow, some are unforgettable because of the money. Others stand out because of their history. But the next story is remarkable for an entirely different reason. It begins with an old box of World War II memorabilia, and it ends with a reunion so extraordinary that it almost feels impossible to believe.
So I brought some of my dad's World War II memorabilia. He was a Dutch Jedburgh, a special ops soldier, and he jumped with General Gavin of the 82nd Airborne.
Right from the beginning, it was already a fascinating story. A special operations soldier, a wartime parachute mission, a connection to one of the most respected American generals of World War II. But then the owner shared another detail that made everyone listen even more closely.
My dad was walking point, and he spotted a machine gunist in a tree and shot him before the machine gunnist had a chance to shoot General Gavin. So General Gavin has always credited my dad with saving his life.
Up to that point, many people might have assumed it was simply a remarkable family story passed down through the generations. Then something happened that no one in the room could have expected. Right there at the Antiques Roadshow event.
I know the story that he saved my grandfather's life, because my grandfather was General Gavin.
The room fell almost completely silent. Two families who had never met before suddenly discovered they had been connected by a single moment on a World War II battlefield decades earlier. It was the kind of coincidence that would seem unbelievable if it appeared in a movie.
But the meat of the value of what you brought today is right here in those three wings.
Really?
While everyone was still absorbing that extraordinary reunion, the expert turned his attention to the three cloth wings lying on the table. At first glance, they looked surprisingly ordinary, but their provenance changed everything.
But because they're him, they're a little better than average. You have in the neighborhood of $10,000 worth of cloth insignia right there on that table.
No way.
About $10,000. Not because they were made from precious materials, but because they belonged to the soldier who saved General Gavin's life, and because they became part of one of the most extraordinary reunions ever witnessed on Antiques Roadshow. Sometimes the true value of a historical artifact isn't found in the object itself. It's found in the people, the memories, and the unexpected connections it brings back together many decades later. After exploring relics from modern wars, we're about to travel much farther back in time. Not 1 century, not 2, but nearly 500 years. The next object wasn't discovered at an auction or purchased from an antique shop. It has remained in the same family for more than half a millennium.
This is your ancestral home.
My family lived here for 550 years till 1946. Some of the contents were removed by my grandfather when he gave Lyme away, and it passed to my father and then has come down to me now.
That story alone makes this artifact remarkable. It isn't simply an antique. It is a piece of family history, carefully preserved and passed down through generation after generation. But what truly caught the expert's attention was the dagger itself.
We've banded agate, and then we've got the use of carnelian. This is a dagger, but it's terribly elegant. It's actually so finely made that it couldn't really be used in anger.
Right.
Banded agate, carnelian, silver. Every detail suggests that this was never intended for the battlefield. It was created to display wealth, refinement, and social status, rather than to serve as a practical weapon. Then the family shared a tradition that made the story even more intriguing.
Well, the family tradition is that it belonged to King Charles I.
Indeed, there is the name in Latin, Carolus, but I have to ask myself, is it Charles I?
If that tradition were true, this would be a royal artifact. But the expert refused to jump to conclusions. Instead, he carefully examined every clue, separating family legend from historical evidence. Even so, the results were remarkable.
We think this is a 16th century piece because its manufacturer is almost certainly Italy. It's a serious European work of art. The lapidary work is absolutely fabulous.
Although its connection to King Charles I could not be confirmed, the dagger's true origins were extraordinary. It was crafted in 16th century Italy. Not merely an antique weapon, but a genuine Renaissance work of art.
I think an auction estimate would have to be between £15,000 and £25,000.
Really? Yeah.
An auction estimate of £15,000 to £25,000 reflected the significance of an artifact that has survived for nearly 5 centuries. Yet perhaps the most memorable part of this story wasn't the valuation. It was seeing a dagger that might appear to be a weapon at first glance, ultimately recognized as a rare and exceptional masterpiece of European Renaissance craftsmanship. How do you put a price on an artifact when the story behind it can never truly be measured in money? That is exactly the challenge presented by the next collection. Because the objects laid out on the table are far more than wartime memorabilia, they are the memories of a man who survived nearly 6 years as a prisoner of war.
He was shot down in North Vietnam in October 27th, 1967, and that he was repatriated March 14th, 1973.
Nearly 6 years. Long enough to change a person's life forever. According to his family, he was imprisoned in some of North Vietnam's most notorious POW camps. Yet even during those difficult years, there were moments that would never be forgotten.
That the first time he ever laughed in jail was a joke that John McCain had tapped through the wall. John McCain was shot down the day before my dad, and they were repatriated the same day.
A joke tapped through a prison wall. A friendship forged under unimaginable circumstances. Small moments like these make history feel deeply personal. But the most emotional artifact was still waiting to be revealed.
This picture is called Burst of Joy. It was taken at Travis Air Force Base on March 17th, 1973. So we just burst out of the car and started running to my dad.
Well, I gotta say, if it was my dad, I'd be leaping too.
The photograph is known as Burst of Joy, one of the most iconic images to emerge from the aftermath of the Vietnam War. It captures the exact moment a family ran toward a father who had finally come home. Years later, the little girl in that famous photograph stood on the Antiques Roadshow stage to tell the story herself.
This is kind of hard to appraise because of the
yes
that goes along with it.
Yes.
I'm having a hard time too.
It was one of the rare occasions when the expert openly admitted that assigning a value felt almost impossible. How do you put a number on memories like these?
As an auction estimate, it would be in the $2,500 to $3,000 range, which doesn't seem like a whole lot. However, the historical value on this is absolutely priceless.
The auction estimate was only $2,500 to $3,000. But even the expert acknowledged that it wasn't the collection's true worth. Its greatest value wasn't found in the uniform, the spoon, or even the photograph. It lived in a story of survival, reunion, and memories that no amount of money could ever replace. Perhaps there could be no more meaningful way to conclude this countdown of extraordinary military treasures from Antiques Roadshow.
If someone told you a small cannon once made a horse go deaf, your first reaction would probably be that it was just another family story passed down through generations. But with the next artifact, that's exactly how the story begins. A tiny cannon, a family memory more than a century old, and a truth even more surprising than the story itself.
I've been told that it was shot off by my grandfather on our farm in Maine, and it made the horse go deaf.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It certainly sounds hard to believe, but within minutes, the expert confirmed that this was no toy. It was an authentic Winchester signal cannon, built for one purpose: to produce an explosion loud enough to get everyone's attention.
It's a signal cannon, and you put in a standard 10-gauge blank shotgun shell. The cannon actually on top says "not for ball."
The manufacturer even engraved a warning directly onto the barrel, reminding owners never to load it with a real projectile. That alone says a lot about how powerful this little cannon could be. But if it wasn't designed for combat, what exactly was it made to do?
And they would generally be used for salute cannons, the beginning of races, anything where you needed a loud bang. This is their model 1898 signal cannon.
In the late 19th century, long before electronic sirens and public address systems, a single cannon blast was often the quickest way to announce that an event had begun. From horse races to ceremonial celebrations, that was the role of the Winchester Model 1898. It may not be the rarest model Winchester ever produced, but it remains a fascinating piece of the company's history.
They made about 18,000 of them in total.
Roughly 18,000 were manufactured. Not an exceptionally small number. Yet after more than 100 years, very few have survived in the kind of condition seen here. So just how much difference would that make?
I would estimate at auction it would bring around $600 to $800.
Oh, wow, that's very nice.
Yeah.
An auction estimate of around $600 to $800. Not the biggest valuation in today's countdown. But sometimes the most memorable part of an artifact isn't the price. It's the remarkable story that has stayed with it for more than a century. And after a signal cannon remembered for deafening a horse, our next story shifts to a collection that reflects the extraordinary courage of a real-life hero. What makes an ordinary group of medals so remarkable that even an experienced Antiques Roadshow expert can't help but pause and admire it? The answer isn't the medal. It's the man who earned them. From the moment these medals were placed on the table, the expert knew he was looking at a very different kind of story.
Well, we often get medals brought to the roadshow, but rarely do we get groups as wonderful as this, which contain not one, but 2 decorations for gallantry.
2 medals awarded for gallantry. That alone makes this collection stand out from countless military artifacts that have appeared on the show. But the biggest surprise wasn't the medals themselves. It was the man who received them.
So he was obviously a great man of action.
Oh, yeah.
And
just 5'4".
5'4", awarded the Military Cross, which is that one, for conspicuous gallantry and initiative when his company commander had become a casualty, and although wounded himself, he took command and led the company through a dense fog.
He stood only 5 feet 4 inches tall. Yet when his commanding officer became a casualty, he stepped forward without hesitation and took command of the entire company. And that was only the beginning. What happened next sounded almost unbelievable.
This warrant officer rushed it by himself, capturing it and the battery of field guns with 1 officer and 20 men.
He charged an enemy position alone, captured an artillery battery, and took 1 officer along with 20 enemy soldiers prisoner. Read on paper, it almost sounds like the plot of a war movie, except every detail was officially recorded in military records.
He would never let me write anything about him when he was alive.
You often find that incredibly brave people just think, and they're always very modest and retiring.
Perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is that he rarely spoke about any of it. That seems to be true of many people who have experienced war firsthand. Sometimes the medals tell far more than the soldiers who wore them ever would.
I think that these are worth between £1,500 to £2,000.
The collection was valued at between £1,500 and £2,000. Not the highest appraisal in today's countdown. But its true value was never about the money. It was the story of a small man who accomplished extraordinary things on the battlefield, then quietly returned home without ever thinking of himself as a hero. If an entire town raised money to buy you a sword, you must have done something that people would never forget. That is exactly where the next story begins. It doesn't start with a collector. It begins with a soldier who returned from the Civil War after being wounded and taken prisoner.
He fought in the Civil War and was wounded down there and held prisoner.
His original sword had been confiscated by Confederate forces after he was captured. When he finally returned home to recover, the people of his hometown decided to do something extraordinary for him. But the story took an unexpected turn.
The town collected money to buy him a new sword.
But he did take that money and bought this sword. And I found a notation where it references, and it says, "I got a good one."
Before the presentation sword could be completed, he was called back to the battlefield. Instead, the townspeople gave him the money and allowed him to choose one for himself. According to the expert, he made an excellent choice. But what made this sword so different from countless other Civil War swords?
It's actually made in Solingen, Germany, and they made really high-end swords such as this one. The blade was actually gold washed at one time, so it was a real high-quality sword.
The sword was made in Solingen, Germany, a city renowned for producing some of Europe's finest blades. Every detail reflects exceptional craftsmanship and quality. Yet the sword's greatest significance had nothing to do with how it was made.
It says, presented to Lieutenant Colonel John B. Reed from the citizens of Bond County, Illinois. He was shot through the lung, and the fact that he survived it all is amazing.
The inscription engraved on the scabbard tells the entire story. It was a gift from the citizens of Bond County to Colonel John B. Reed, a man who survived a gunshot through the lung, endured captivity as a prisoner of war, and somehow made it home alive. That is what gives this sword a meaning far beyond the object itself.
This is a sword that if I were going to insure it, I would insure it for $6,000.
Okay, wow.
An insurance value of around $6,000. A respectable appraisal. But for this family, the sword has never been just another antique. It stands as a symbol of gratitude, survival, and the memory of a soldier whose hometown chose to honor him with a gift that would outlive generations.
What if the most valuable item in a collection wasn't made of gold, silver, or a rare weapon, but simply an old postcard? That's exactly where this story begins. The objects on this table were never meant to become collectibles. They survived because a young woman survived one of the darkest chapters in human history.
My mother was born in the town of Sosnowiec in Poland in February 1926. She was the child of religious Jews. World War II began for her in September of 1939. And in February of 1942, shortly after her 16th birthday, my mother was summoned to the train station.
She was only 16. While most teenagers were thinking about school and the future, she was taken to a forced labor camp. Months later, she was finally able to send a postcard home. No one knew how many more letters like that there would ever be.
She was able to write home to her parents.
This is the front side of the postcard.
Dear parents, I wonder why you don't write more often. I wonder what is going on.
That small postcard became one of the very few remaining links between a young girl and her family. Today, a message takes only seconds to send. But in 1942, a single postcard could also become the last one a family would ever receive. And that was only the beginning of the story.
One day the SS came in and announced that any workers who were not assigned to a machine would have to go for resettlement. And she said, I looked up at him and I said, am I going to have to leave also? And this foreman said to her, not you, you're one of my best workers. This was a camp of all Jewish girls, knew what resettlement meant. It meant they might be sent to a death camp.
One answer changed the course of her life. She was allowed to stay. Many others were not. After the war, she learned that her parents and younger siblings had been murdered at Auschwitz. At that moment, the objects on the table became far more than family keepsakes. They became evidence of a life that somehow endured the unimaginable.
One of the things that is incredibly difficult is part of what we do here is put a monetary value on something. And you say, how can you put a monetary value on this?
It was the same question the appraiser found himself asking. How do you put a price on a postcard, a few photographs, or clothing sewn inside a labor camp, when their greatest value lies in the stories they still preserve?
There are very, very few three-dimensional objects that came out of those camps. A value on this, either for insurance or donation, would be $10,000. Although the real value is in how it can be used to teach the future generations.
For us,
around $10,000. That may be the market value. But everyone in the room understood it was never the number that mattered most. The true value lies in the fact that these objects still exist, preserving the voices of people who are no longer here to tell their own stories. And after a chapter defined by unimaginable loss, the final story in today's countdown will take us to one of the rare moments in wartime when compassion briefly spoke louder than weapons. Wars are usually remembered through battles and gunfire. But what if the final artifact in today's video was nothing more than a single piece of paper? A piece of paper that has survived for more than a century, and perhaps the most moving proof that even in the middle of war, people could still choose humanity over hatred.
Everybody knows something about the Christmas truces. They happened, even though there's lots of records, but it wasn't an official thing.
The Christmas truce of 1914 remains one of the most remarkable stories of the First World War. British and German soldiers temporarily stopped fighting, exchanged gifts, and even sang Christmas carols together. For decades, many people dismissed those stories as little more than wartime legend. Until this remarkable document appeared.
Now, this is a signal received by a signaller of the Hampshire Regiment, James Pace. And he received the signal on the 27th of December 1914, and he wrote it down as it came over the wires.
This wasn't a personal letter, nor was it a diary. It was an official signal, written down exactly as it arrived from the other side of the front line. More than 100 years later, the message still survives. And what it says leaves everyone in the room speechless.
Gentlemen, our automatic rifle has order from the Colonel to begin the fire again at midnight. We take the honour to let you know of this fact. Don't be out in no man's land, because our guns will begin firing.
It was a warning from the enemy, not to threaten, but to save the lives of the very men they would be forced to fight again only hours later. It was one of those extraordinary moments when humanity briefly outweighed war itself.
This is an old-fashioned chivalry. The enemy, they've come to the truce, they've all fraternized, they've talked to each other, they've exchanged gifts.
Just a single sheet of paper. Yet it transports us back to the winter of 1914, when soldiers shook hands, exchanged gifts, and sang together before returning to the trenches. It reminds us that the men on the opposite side of the battlefield were simply human beings longing to return home.
That whole sense of what it must have been like in that first Christmas of the war is brought to life by pieces of paper like this.
And perhaps there is no better way to end today's countdown. We've seen remarkable guns, swords, medals, and countless military treasures from history's greatest conflicts. Yet in the end, what stays with us isn't the firepower or the astonishing appraisals. It's the stories of the people who once held these objects in their hands. Because history is never remembered for its artifacts alone. It is remembered for the lives behind them. And that is why forgotten treasures like these continue to captivate millions of viewers every time they appear on Antiques Roadshow. When people think of Colonel Sanders, they usually picture the familiar face on every KFC logo. But if someone told you that Colonel Sanders once lived in their family's basement for several months, you would probably assume it was just an unbelievable family story. Yet for the guest on Antiques Roadshow, that was simply part of growing up. And that extraordinary friendship eventually led to a keepsake that very few people have ever had the chance to own.
In 1975, Colonel Sanders bought my parents' home, and we actually built a house right next to him. So he came to my father and he asked him, he said, "Is it okay if my wife and I stay in your basement while you're building your house next to mine?" So for 6 months, he and Claudia Sanders lived in our basement of the home.
This wasn't a brief encounter. The family lived next door to Colonel Sanders for years, sharing dinners with him, watching television together, and getting to know the man behind one of America's most recognizable brands. That is why the item on the table today is much more than a white suit. It carries memories that simply cannot be measured in dollars.
Well, when I was a senior in high school, we had a Halloween costume party at our school. So I went over and asked the Colonel if I could borrow one of his suits. And then after the contest was over with, the Colonel said, "Because you looked so fantastic, you can have the suit as a memento."
Unbelievable.
What began as a borrowed Halloween costume unexpectedly became a personal gift from Colonel Sanders himself. But that was only the beginning. As the appraisal continued, several details confirmed that this was indeed one of the iconic white suits he had personally worn.
We can also see on the inside of the suit that it does have the label, which reads Warren Kluk tailored especially for Colonel H. Sanders. We have this reprint of a canvas that he signed to you and dated. And as an autograph, it would be valued at about $300 to $500.
Even by itself, the signed photograph carries meaningful collectible value. But everyone in the room knew the true centerpiece was the legendary white suit. Then came the appraisal everyone had been waiting for.
If this was to come up on the secondary market at auction, it would bring between $30,000 and $50,000.
My gosh, you're kidding me.
There was in 2002 a charity auction where one of his white suits came up with the shirt and it sold for charity for $80,000.
Oh my gosh.
An estimated value of $30,000 to $50,000 was enough to leave anyone speechless. Yet the greatest value of this suit was never its auction price. It lives in the memories attached to it, a global icon who spent time as an ordinary neighbor, read Christmas stories to 2 children, and left behind not only one of the world's most famous brands, but also deeply personal moments that continue to bring smiles decades later. Some letters become famous because of the person who wrote them. Others are preserved because of the person who received them. But the next artifact is extraordinary for a different reason. It was written by one of America's greatest poets, not for himself, but on behalf of a dying Civil War soldier who could no longer write to his own family.
When you're doing the show, you don't know what's coming in. And one of the things that did come in was this Walt Whitman letter.
To my mom's great-great-great-grandfather, Walt Whitman would be the scribe for injured soldiers in Washington, D.C. during the Civil War.
Most people know Walt Whitman through his poetry. What amazed the appraiser was that this letter had survived for well over a century. It offered a rare glimpse into another side of Whitman's life, one that few people ever talk about.
The letter is dated in 1863 in Washington. One of the things he did was soldiers who were too sick to write home, he would sit there and write letters for them. And you see, this is all in Walt Whitman's handwriting.
Whitman was not writing poetry here. He was quietly recording the final thoughts of a wounded soldier who was still trying to reassure his family, even though he would die only 2 weeks later. It is just a single sheet of paper, yet it preserves one deeply personal moment from American history.
I did a lot of checking, and I didn't find hardly any letters that he wrote for the patients. I would say that a collector would easily pay in the $8,000 to $12,000 retail range.
Gosh.
The appraisal alone came as a complete surprise to the family, but the story did not end there. After the roadshow, the letter was examined by one of the world's leading Walt Whitman scholars.
I've been working with Whitman's manuscripts for 30 years or so. Sometimes he just inscribes it and then selflessly does this as a service to other people.
We had no idea that it would be anything like this.
According to the expert, the greatest significance of the letter is not simply that it was written by Walt Whitman. It is that he quietly used his own handwriting to help wounded soldiers say goodbye to the people they loved. It reveals a side of the celebrated poet that very few people ever have the chance to see.
The original appraised price was $8,000 to $12,000. I think now you could probably get into the maybe $15,000 or $20,000. If you want an example of the type of letter that he wrote in the Civil War for somebody, you might never get one in a whole career of collecting.
Originally valued at $8,000 to $12,000, the letter could now be worth between $15,000 and $20,000. Yet for serious Walt Whitman collectors, its true importance goes far beyond the price. It represents an opportunity that may come only once in a lifetime to hold an authentic letter written by Walt Whitman for a Civil War soldier whose own voice could no longer reach home.